Good morning. Well, thank you very much for that gracious introduction, and let me just say it's a great pleasure to be here at this conference sponsored by the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Franklin as part of the Clinton Initiative on Race, which I will talk a little bit about later in my speech. But it certainly is a wonderful thing to have this legacy here in Tulsa, and I am honored to have been invited to participate in this conference. The theme, as you know, is the politics of reconciliation. And I had the opportunity to hear some of the presentations yesterday afternoon, which I found to be quite thought-provoking. And to be one of the closing speakers is a little bit of a challenge because you have to prepare your speech before you hear what other people have said. And, but you also, the good part is you also have a chance to respond a little bit to what you've heard said. So I'm hopeful that what I will say, which I've tweaked a little bit last night, will resonate with and complement what has come before. I also hope that there'll be time for questions, so we'll see how that goes. But it's my hope that we could have a little bit of a conversation. Those book titles you heard are all long, but they all have the word, two of the three have the word conversation in the title. And it is my hope that we'll have some conversation here. As you know, as you've heard, I am a psychologist, and I tend to look at the world through the psychological lens of analysis. So when asked to be a speaker at this conference and asked what would the title of my presentation be, it was easy to say the title is The Psychology of Reconciliation. The title was the easy part. The challenge was trying to conceptualize a talk that would be fitting for this gathering. And I began by thinking about the concept of forgiveness, but quickly realized that forgiveness itself does not lead to reconciliation. I thought of examples in my own life in which I had felt deeply wronged by someone. Fortunately, that has not happened often, but in those few instances, I struggled to let go of my anger about what had happened. In one case, my first thought was of revenge. How could I even the score with the person who had injured me? But then I realized what I wanted most was to be completely free of that person, to no longer have any relationship at all, and to get even would require continued interaction. Once I realized that truth, I knew I had to release the anger, as intense as it was, otherwise I would never be free of that other person. In the words of Nelson Mandela, having resentment against someone is like drinking poison and thinking it will kill your enemy. Isn't that a good quote? I tweeted that. Having resentment against someone is like drinking poison and thinking it will kill your enemy. I could certainly feel in my own situation that my anger was toxic to me and to me alone, and I had to let it go. And in a moment of grace, I did release it. I even felt able to forgive. But forgiveness did not lead to reconciliation. I have no relationship with that person today, nor do I want one. I moved past anger to absence. That is not reconciliation. When we talk about reconciliation, we are by definition talking about individuals or groups who intend, by choice or necessity, to remain in relationship with one another. And that is more complicated. When I let go of my anger, the other person did not have to do anything except leave me alone. Eventually, I moved to another city and our paths no longer crossed. But when we are part of a community, or as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once said, an inescapable network of mutuality, where one part of the community has been wronged by another, true reconciliation cannot occur without joint participation. So, if it is not just forgiveness, what is true reconciliation? Here in Tulsa, as we recall the horrific events of 91 years ago, now known as the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, this question has particular salience. The murders of many by white attackers, the destruction of hundreds of homes, and the ruin of a thriving commercial district has had an enduring impact on this community, disproportionately felt by the black survivors of the assault and their descendants. Hard-won economic gains made by a lifetime of effort by former slaves and their descendants were wiped out in a weekend of violence, from which some never recovered. To quote the online encyclopedia entry of the Oklahoma Historical Society, it reads, "The deep scars left by the riot remain visible for years. While Greenwood was eventually rebuilt, many families never truly recovered from the disaster. Moreover, for many years, the riot became something of a taboo subject, particularly in Tulsa. A state commission formed in 1997 to investigate the riot recommended that reparations be paid to the remaining riot survivors, while a team of scientists and historians uncovered evidence supporting long-held beliefs that unidentified riot victims had been buried in unmarked grave sites. One of the great tragedies of Oklahoma history, the Tulsa race riot has lived on as a potent symbol of the ongoing struggle of black and white Oklahomans to forge a common destiny out of an often troubled past." End quote. To forge a common destiny out of an often troubled past is a phrase that provides a framework for understanding why reconciliation, in this case racial reconciliation, is necessary, not just in Oklahoma but across the nation. Like it or not, we do indeed have a common destiny. We will succeed or fail together. So, I return to the question of true reconciliation. What is it? The online version of the Merriam-Webster Dictionary offers several definitions of the verb to reconcile. And in some ways, they are all relevant. The first definition you'll find is to restore to friendship or harmony, as in reconcile the factions. But has there ever been true friendship or harmony to which one can return in this instance? Of course, one can find individual instances of interracial friendship, even love. But we know the history of black-white intergroup relations in America began with the subjugation of enslaved Africans, and there can be no genuine friendship or harmony based on mutual respect and recognition of the other's shared humanity while in the condition of enslavement. Enslavement was replaced by Jim Crow subjugation and institutionalized segregation. At best, post-slavery, we might describe black-white race relations as uneasy coexistence, one easily disrupted by a literal misstep by a black man in Tulsa who in 1921 inadvertently stepped on the foot of a white woman as he entered an elevator, causing her to scream, and ultimately leading to his arrest and the actions of an angry white lynch mob. As you know, considered to be the single worst incident of racial violence in American history, it is not just the trauma of the Tulsa race riot that is the source of disharmony. Oklahoma, as a state, has a long and painful history surrounding school desegregation. The judicial history of desegregation in Oklahoma began in 1961 in Oklahoma City as the result of a lawsuit to integrate the schools which had been segregated by order of the state Constitution ever since Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907. In 1963, federal Judge Luther Bohannon ruled that the dual system of education be ended. The Oklahoma City School Board adopted a neighborhood zoning plan in response, but because of residential segregation, the end result of racially restrictive real estate covenants supported by state and local law, the neighborhood zoning plan was ineffective. Finally, in 1972, because little progress toward desegregation had been made, Judge Bohannon ordered a busing plan designed to achieve racial balance. 5 years later, in 1977, the Oklahoma City School Board asked Judge Bohannon to close the case, and he did, expressing his confidence that the board would continue to comply with constitutional desegregation requirements. However, just a few years later, in 1985, the school board reinstated the neighborhood zoning plan, and Robert Dowell and the other original plaintiffs asked that the case be reopened. In 1989, the 10th Circuit of Appeals ruled in their favor, instructing the Oklahoma City Board to design a new plan to integrate the Oklahoma City schools. The school board appealed, and it went before the Supreme Court. The court sent the case back to Judge Bohannon to decide whether the state had satisfied the original desegregation order. In the end, Judge Bohannon ruled in the state's favor and closed the case. In his book, Jim Crow's Children, Peter Irons concludes, with student assignments now based on the neighborhood school policy, Oklahoma City schools have become even more racially separated. In the year 2000, black students were the largest racial group, comprising 39% of public school enrollment, more than twice the citywide black population of 16%. White students made up 33% in 2000, while Hispanic students had become a growing minority at 20%. Substantially more than half of the city's black children now attend majority black schools, with more than half of the white children in majority white schools. The outcome of the Dowell case seemed to justify the gloomy prediction of Thurgood Marshall 17 years earlier, that the court's abandonment of the Brown decisions would result in America's urban areas being divided up each into two cities, one white, the other black, with the children in each divided city attending schools in which few of their classmates belonged to a different race. Indeed, the Oklahoma City versus Dowell decision had the ripple effect of federal judges releasing other school districts from their court-ordered desegregation plans. This and other related court decisions in the 1990s have contributed to increasing rather than decreasing school segregation. Following the Oklahoma decision, which supported resegregation, for the first time since the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision 58 years ago, segregation in Southern public schools is steadily increasing, and the largely intractable segregation of northern cities has intensified. While there may be occasional exceptions to this pattern, ironically, just as this conference marks the anniversary of the Tulsa race riots, we are just a couple weeks past the 58th anniversary of the May 17, 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, an anniversary we periodically mark without fully acknowledging the reality of K-12 public school resegregation and the continuing wound that it inflicts. Though the media presence of people of color and the election of a black president might create the assumption that we now live, work, and go to school in an integrated society, for many in the United States, that simply is not true. According to the 2010 census data, the U.S. population is now approximately 72% white, 16% Hispanic, 13% black, 5% Asian American, 0.9% American Indian or Alaska Native or Pacific Islander, and 3% of census participants now identify themselves as belonging to two or more races. That diversity, however, is not reflected in most neighborhoods. As immigration increases in our border states and the population of color multiplies in cities across the nation, one can find a rich urban mosaic of varying cultures and ethnicities, but more often than not, these diverse cultural communities are separated neighborhood by neighborhood, and often school by school. Most African Americans, Latinos, and whites still live in neighborhoods with people from their same racial group. Racial segregation is also associated with economic segregation. The vast majority of those living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty are black or Latino. Blacks as a group continue to experience the most residential segregation as compared to other groups of color. Approximately 1/3 of all African Americans live in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. It is clear that those of us who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, the baby boomers among us, are products of a historically unique period of time, a period of progress toward integration which is not widely shared by young people today. As we consider reconciliation, as in the restoration of friendship and harmony, it is important for us to understand the significance of continuing residential segregation and increasing school resegregation. One potential consequence is that while interracial contact and more tolerant racial attitudes increased during the last half of the 20th century, the same may not be true in the first quarter of the 21st century, particularly in our public schools. For both whites and blacks, the likelihood of having either a multiracial social network of acquaintances or at least one close interracial friendship was linked to the experience of attending racially mixed schools in childhood. And we heard actually yesterday Mayor Webb from Denver talking about how meaningful it was to his leadership as mayor that he had attended a very diverse high school when he was growing up. As school districts move back to neighborhood school policies, the next generation of white students will likely have less school contact with people of color, than their predecessors did. Particularly for young white children, interaction with people of color is likely to be a virtual reality rather than an actual one, with media images, often negative ones, most clearly shaping their attitudes and perceived knowledge of communities of color. The progress that has been made in the reduction of racial prejudice that can be associated with shared school experiences is at risk of stalling. For students of color, the return to segregation means the increased likelihood of attending a school with limited resources. We know that 90% of highly segregated Black and Latino schools have high percentages of poor children. However, at most highly segregated white schools, middle-class students are in the majority. The negative educational impact of attending a high-poverty school is well documented. Whether a student comes from a poor or middle-income family, academic achievement is likely to decline if the student attends a high-poverty school. Conversely, academic performance is likely to improve if the student attends a middle-class school, even if his or her own family is poor. The learning conditions which are taken for granted in middle-class suburban schools are too often absent in impoverished classrooms. As an example, the American Civil Liberties Union filed suit in 2000 against the state of California on behalf of children in 18 public school districts, charging that children who attend schools without such basics as sufficient books, materials, working bathroom facilities, clean and safe buildings, trained teachers, and enough seats for every child are being denied their fundamental right to an education. In this case, 96.4% of the children affected by these dismal conditions were children of color, even though as a group, children of color represent only 59% of the public school population in California. It's not surprising that the outcomes associated with high poverty schools across the country are bleak. Lower test scores, higher dropout rates, fewer course offerings, and low levels of college attendance. We need to remember that the fight for school desegregation was not simply a symbolic fight for the acknowledgement of the humanity and equality of all children. Fundamentally, it was a struggle for equal access to publicly funded educational resources. Clearly, that struggle continues, and its continuation directly impacts the possibility of the restoration of friendship and harmony, or reconciliation, across racial lines. But to reconcile can also mean to settle or resolve, as in reconcile differences. Reconciliation of differences requires taking time to understand what the differences are. Effective cross-racial dialogue is possible, but unfortunately uncommon. When President Bill Clinton launched his race initiative in 1997, 15 years ago, he said that the timing for such a national conversation was good because the nation was not at war and experiencing prosperity. It was at such a moment, he said, that the capacity to do the hard emotional work of engaging with each other about a painful subject such as race and racism was at its greatest. I believe President Clinton was correct in his assessment, but unfortunately his efforts became derailed in the public eye by the distraction of the Monica Lewinsky affair, a news story that broke just a few months after the race initiative was launched, and then the subsequent impeachment proceedings. Public attention to the opportunity for dialogue presented by the Clinton race initiative was diverted before it could really take hold. Now, as a nation at war in Afghanistan and until recently in Iraq, and with a struggling economy and widespread economic hardship, we are not a nation ready to engage in dialogue as much as we are ready to hunker down and defend our individual positions. It is that defensive posture that is being modeled for us daily on the nightly news by our political leaders. Examples of reconciliation, as in settling of differences, are rare indeed. But reconcile also means to make consistent or congruous, as in reconcile an ideal with reality. And for those of us who pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all, we need reconciliation to make our actions as a community, as a state, and as a nation consistent with those ideals. When there is no restoration or reparation to the survivors of the state-inflicted wounds caused by the Tulsa race riot, when there is no educational equity, or when there is unequal treatment under the law, as was witnessed in the circumstances following the killing of young Trayvon Martin. Our legitimacy as a democracy anchored by a constitution that has been amended to provide freedom and protection to all of its citizens, regardless of race, is gravely diminished. To reconcile an ideal with reality requires action which is congruous with the ideals. There can be no reconciliation without such action. To reconcile can also mean to cause to submit or to accept something unpleasant, as in she was reconciled to hardship. It is this form of reconciliation which is perhaps most evident in contemporary society. The recent passivity of communities of color, particularly in terms of electoral politics since the presidential election of 2008, is just one example of such apparent reconciliation to subjugated status. In psychological terms, we sometimes speak of learned helplessness, the phenomenon that occurs when repeated attempts to escape a painful situation have failed. Over time, a person may succumb to a sense of helplessness that persists even when the circumstance has changed. One who has been trapped in a cage a long time may not even recognize the opportunity to escape when the door is finally opened. The irony in our current circumstance is that it is not just people of color who have been trapped by the dysfunction of racism in our society. Wendell Berry, a white writer raised in Kentucky, wrote quite movingly in his memoir titled The Hidden Wound about the psychic cost of racism to him and members of his racial group. He wrote, "If white people have suffered less obviously from racism than black people, they have nevertheless suffered greatly. The cost has been greater perhaps than we can yet know. If the white man has inflicted the wound of racism upon black men, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound into himself. As the master or as a member of the dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge it or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it within himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, as great a damage in his mind as it is in his society." End quote. And though throughout this talk, as Wendell Berry does in his quote, I have referenced race relations in terms of black-white relationships, largely framed by the historical specifics of the Tulsa race riot, it is important to acknowledge that there is a history requiring reconciliation beyond just black-white relations, a point certainly understood by the indigenous community of Native Americans in Oklahoma, as well as other communities of color. These are issues that impact all of us, regardless of race or ethnicity. Reconciliation to the status quo is one form of reconciliation that we do not need and that none of us can afford. In a global economy in which America needs to be at its best, reconciliation to a dysfunction will be disastrous for our success as a nation. To again invoke the words of Dr. King, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. He added, "I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." Finally, to reconcile means to check a financial account against another for accuracy, as in to reconcile a ledger. Though we don't often talk about reconciliation between people in this way, there is a form of accounting that is needed for true reconciliation. There needs to be acknowledgement of pain caused and of injuries done that is part of the healing process. This is perhaps most clearly evidenced in the work of the famous South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission led by Bishop Tutu after the end of apartheid. As part of the process, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission established something called the Register of Reconciliation. The register was not a checkbook register of the kind in which we balance our withdrawals and deposits, but it did allow for a kind of accounting which helped the nation's healing process. You can find entries in the Register of Reconciliation online, and I read some of the postings in preparation for this talk. At the website, you will find this note of explanation. It says, "This register gave members of the public a chance to express their regret at failing to prevent human rights violations and to demonstrate their commitment to reconciliation." Mrs. Mary Burton, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission commissioner, who proposed the establishment of the register, explains, "The register has been established in response to a deep wish for reconciliation in the hearts of many South Africans. People who did not perhaps commit gross violations of human rights, but nevertheless wish to indicate their regret for failures in the past to do all they could have done to prevent such violations. People who want to demonstrate in some symbolic way their commitment to a new kind of future in which human rights abuses will not take place. We know that many South Africans are ready and eager to turn away from a past history of division and discrimination. Guilt for wrongdoing needs to be translated into a positive commitment to building a better society, the healthiest and most productive form of atonement." Among the register postings that I read, I was particularly impressed by this one, posted on December 15th, 1997, and the name was there, Dr. Merle Friedman, a resident of Johannesburg. Dr. Friedman wrote, "It is with deep regret that I reflect on my past. It is with deep sorrow that I acknowledge my complicity as a white South African. And it is with immeasurable guilt that I assume responsibility for my role in our shameful past. I cannot say I did not know. I can only say that I chose not to know. I chose the safety of my own family over my moral duty to my compatriots. I chose my own comfort over the pain of knowing and the imperative to risk that this knowledge would bring. I raised and educated my children with privilege, whilst those around me were deprived. I am so deeply sorry, and the opportunity to express this regret and offer apology does not unburden me. This privilege allows me to reach even further into my soul to express the remorse that I feel. It impels me to continue to see, in my own small way, to help repair the damage to our people and our land caused not only by perpetrators, but also by us, the bystanders, in the tragedy of our past. It impels me also to rejoice in the present freedom to build a new and great South Africa." The opportunity for this kind of national accounting has never happened in the United States in any systemic way. I imagine that even the suggestion of such a thing would result in the outpouring of defensive venom from some quarters. Such is the toxic nature of the conversation about race at this moment in our history. Yet, recognizing that we all, regardless of racial group membership, have participated in the dysfunction of racism in our society in some way, actively or passively, and all stand in need of reconciliation in at least one of its many definitions. So where do we go from here? This is where leadership is required, and it was so clearly modeled yesterday by Mayor Webb and Mayor Savage in the panel. Certainly today, we live in an anxiety-ridden time. If we had more time together, I could talk at length from a psychologist's perspective about the anxiety that comes from a changing paradigm, when things happen in ways you don't expect. And there is no example of a paradigm-changing event in the American imagination, given our collective history, than seeing a black president serving as commander-in-chief in the White House. That reality is unsettling for many, but unsettling enough for many, but add to it the 2008 collapse of the American economy prior to the 2008 election, the financial threat that many are experiencing, the ruptured sense of security brought on by 9/11, almost now more than a decade ago, and other terrorist attacks on American soil, including one here in Oklahoma, and the slow recognition that the United States might not always be number one in the world, and perhaps especially that white people will not always be the majority group in the United States. And you have the ingredients for a serious sense of psychological threat, even fear. And how do we deal with fear? As human beings, like other animals, typically we deal with fear by either withdrawing or attacking. In the current climate of incivility, we see evidence of both patterns. The withdrawal takes the form of hunkering down, pulling in and pulling away from those we feel threatened by. When we are afraid, we quickly begin to categorize who is for me, who is against me. We start to think and act in terms of us and them. We withdraw into our circles of safety, and we attack those we believe are outside that circle and who pose a threat. That is what we see in Arizona with the new laws against immigrants, and the many states, 22 of them now, lining up with similar legislation. It is why we are seeing a sharp rise in hate groups and in racially and ethnically motivated hate crimes. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number has grown by 54% in the last 8 years. And in some cities like Boston, the YWCA reports racially and ethnically motivated hate crimes have risen by 39% over the last 3 years. Living in a time of rapid social change, one might ask, well, how am I supposed to manage my anxiety and my fear? By lashing out? Certainly we see that kind of irrational response growing more common too. Incivility has become more common because our society seems to have given us permission to behave in that way. We see more and more examples every day of people out of control. Check your local television station for the latest reality show. YouTube videos of teens fighting literally to the death, rude and unruly behavior in the real lives of reality television and on the nightly news. What is the daily lesson? I call these symptoms birthing pains. Birthing pains because something new is emerging. But let us be clear, while something new could be quite positive, the moment of birth can be a dangerous time. And I think we are living in a dangerous time and should take that danger seriously. When I listen to the polarizing rhetoric of radio and TV commentators, full of us-them language, I think of a book I read last year, Left to Tell, by Immaculata Ilibagiza, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. She speaks in her book of the hostile rhetoric that was on the radio airways before and during the genocide, demonizing the ethnic minority to which she belonged. That rhetoric was made especially powerful because it came from the country's leaders. I do not mean to suggest that what we are seeing in the United States today is on par with what was happening in Rwanda. But I do want to make clear that what we say matters, and leadership matters. The expectations and values of the leaders can change the tone of the community and the nature of our conversation. And again, I think we had two great examples here yesterday in talking about Denver and Tulsa in Mayor Webb and Mayor Savage. Fundamentally, we know that human beings are not that different from other social animals. Not unlike wolves, we follow the leader. Yes, we have an innate tendency to think in us and them categories, but we also have an innate tendency to look to the leader to help us know who the us is and who the them is. The leader can define who is in the circle and who is out. The leader can draw the circle narrowly or widely. When the leader draws the circle in an exclusionary way, with rhetoric of hostility, the sense of threat among the followers is heightened. When the rhetoric is expansive and inclusionary, the threat is reduced. It sounds simple, but we know it's not. It requires courage to draw your circles that way, and sometimes it means we must speak up against strident voices. But that is what leaders are supposed to do. The leader has to ask the question, how is the circle being drawn? Who is inside it? Who is outside it? What can I do to make the circle bigger, more inclusive? And I want to pause here to say that when I use the word leader, I'm not just talking about elected officials. Any one of you can be a leader or perhaps is a leader in your spheres of influence. We all have spheres of influence in which we are given an opportunity to decide how we're drawing the circle, whether that's within our own families, within our church communities, within our neighborhoods, within our places of employment, whatever our spheres of influence happen to be. So again, the leader has to ask the question, how is the circle being drawn? Who is inside it? Who is outside it? What can I do to make the circle bigger, more inclusive? We do live in a time when fear is rising, and us-them lines are being drawn in a way that does not bode well for the health of our society. We cannot lock people out and expect success. We cannot lock people in and expect success. Truly, we are caught in a web of mutuality, and that means we must look to include rather than exclude. We must expand opportunity for all, not limit it. We must recognize talent in all communities, including low-income communities of color, not overlook it. We must set the example, knowing that others will follow. When we do that, we will indeed be on the road to reconciliation, meaning on the road to friendship and harmony, on the road to being able to understand and resolve differences, on the road to making sure our ideals are aligned with our reality, no longer accepting the status quo, but instead on the road to taking accountability for our actions and, to borrow a phrase from Dr. Friedman of Johannesburg, we will be able to rejoice in the present freedom to build a new and greater America. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much for your response. I'm told we have a little time for questions, and so I do hope we'll have a conversation.
May I pose one?
So, certainly.
Since I'm standing up.
Yes, absolutely.
To apply what you're talking about to our particular situation in Tulsa, we have just completed a survey of attitudes towards race, relations, and history in Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
And June 12th, we'll begin the process to have dialogue. One of the things that the survey done with the University of Oklahoma showed, there were open-ended questions, and many people wrote extensive essays. It was as if it was the first time in their lives they had been asked to reflect on these issues. And a couple of those questions dealt with reconciliation.
Yes.
What does reconciliation look like? One of the major insights that we gained is people don't know what reconciliation even means. That's why this is such a helpful discussion. Some equate it with reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Some don't. I mean, there's just a lot of fuzziness, and this is from wrong responses. How can we help? We're going to have dialogue. How can we help this community come together around some generally shared concept of what reconciliation looks like?
That's a great question. I mean, as you heard me say, there are multiple definitions, right? And so it's not unlike talking about racism. I'm going to just use that for an example, because I wrote this book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race. And the first chapter of the book is all about definitions, right? And I lay out the definition of racism that I use, which is racism is a system of advantage based on race, and talk about why that's different from prejudice and why it's different from discrimination or bigotry or, other words that people sometimes use, that they're not all interchangeable. And I, spend several pages talking about just wanting to lay out for the reader what the definition is. And then I say, you may not agree with my definition, but at least you know what it is, right? And I think that there probably would be value in having some conversations, maybe even using the various versions of, the Webster's dictionary version of reconciliation to say, what are we talking about? Are we talking about trying to restore friendship and harmony? Well, has there been ever friendship and harmony in this community? And if not, what would it take to build some friendship and to create some harmony? Or are we talking about reconciliation in the sense of settling differences? Well, what are those differences, and how do we understand them? And just having dialogue about, you can't resolve a difference until you're really clear about what the difference is. Or are we talking about aligning with our values? What do we say our values are, and what are the, if we look at the reality, does it match up with our ideals? And if not, what would it take to match that up in this community? Yes.
Wonderful presentation. I can't wait to get to that.
Thanks.
I still want to all these presentation as 11. during Depressions and the early 20th century, there were massive lynchings.
Yes.
Not just in the South, it was around the country,
Mm-hmm.
but terribly focused in the South. And one of the questions that came to mind after doing some research was that many of the lynching sessions were presided over by ministers of the gospel, by pastors.
Mm-hmm.
Men, women, and children were brought.
Like picnics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like your view, since you are a clinical psychologist, and of what the leadership role for church people, at least as Christian and primarily evangelical,
Yes.
in healing this history. First of all, just examining the consequences of lynching and what it meant psychologically, certainly.
Yes.
But apparently it was like a burnt offerings. Bodies were burned. It was like prehistoric sacrifice.
Yes.
What can Christian leaders and what can evangelicals especially do to review that history, acknowledge responsibility of their predecessors, and find a way to getting back to something that Jesus had in mind?
Yes. Well, thank you for your question, and I think that it's certainly we want to acknowledge that there are a number of ministers, white ministers, who have written about healing racism. The one name that comes to mind is Joseph Brandt, who is a Christian pastor who's written quite a lot about it, and there are others who have. But I think there is a very important role in that the church has to play, that the church has to play and has to play, right? That the church must play and can play in reconciliation. When we think about, people often talk about, Sunday, 11 o'clock, Sunday being the most segregated hour of the week. I don't think the solution is necessarily to say we all have to go to church together. There are different worship styles. I have a dear friend who is a white woman who for many years was a practicing Quaker, and I visited her Quaker meeting with her, and she attended church with me, and we were great friends, but I didn't want to sit in silence for an hour. And so, there are cultural and historic styles that may remain distinct, and some people will make their choices. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that people don't all go to church together necessarily. However, I think that it is when we think about the way that the church was used, the Bible was misappropriated to defend slavery, for example. The lines of Paul, slaves, obey your master, and the whole, you don't need me to go into all the misuse of theology to defend subjugation of others. Yet at the same time, there's a clear biblical imperative. Yesterday someone said, love your neighbor. I'm not remembering. Was it you, Mr. Gandhi, who said, someone was speaking, I don't remember now who said the message was not try to love your neighbor, or hope to, love your neighbor if you feel like it. It was love your neighbor, right? And so the reality is that there is a clear opportunity for witness to come from pulpits all across the nation, which has not been widely utilized. I have a long history of facilitating unlearning racism workshops prior to becoming the president of Spelman. And one of the most meaningful ones was one that I did with a co-facilitator, a friend of mine, close friend, who's now a minister herself, ordained minister. Her name is Andrea Vazian, but Andrea and I were doing this workshop together in St. Louis, it happened to be in St. Louis in 1991, with a group of clergy, multi-faith group of clergy, around this issue of unlearning racism. And what was so striking to me was the fear that was expressed by clergy members about what might happen to them in their roles if they were to speak about these issues from the pulpit. And particularly white clergy being worried that they would be driven out of their congregations. And this is perhaps naive on my part. But at the time I remember thinking, aren't you like the messenger of God? Like, don't you have the cloak of protection? Why are you worried about that? But it was nonetheless striking to me how fearful and honest people were about their anxiety, about, whether their congregations would tolerate their talk, about that in the context of, the greater St. Louis community, as an example. But I think you're absolutely right. As I said, there are people who are writing about it. I know that there are seminaries that are teaching about it and helping, the whole liberation theology idea is something that, many pastors embrace, and I think it's a real opportunity for leadership. Thank you. Yes.
As a person of color, I'm often offered an opportunity to come together in conversation and dialogue with other people of color and with white people.
Mm-hmm.
And I often find that that is very, very draining and challenging to me
Mm-hmm.
because I encounter situations where I feel that the white people turn to me and to the other people of color
Yes.
and say, tell us the perspective of the particular community of color that you represent.
Mm-hmm.
Is if I come into the conversation as the representative of my whole race,
Yes.
but white people are allowed to come to the conversation as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I often want to say to white people, I think you need to do more work on your own and understanding white privilege and other issues around our ability to reconcile or not reconcile before you come into the conversation with me.
Yes.
And can you talk about that?
Yes.
From the standpoint of helping me get energy to continue to participate in the conversation, because there are days when I just get tired.
Yes, understood. So let me just say, there's so much I want to say in response to what you've just asked. The first thing I want to say, in general, is that if you make a lot of withdrawals, you have to make a lot of deposits, right? So whatever you're doing, if it's wearing you out, you have to. If it's a withdrawal, you have to find ways to deposit, right? To rejuvenate. So in the context of what you just described, spending time with other people of color who clearly, this is why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, getting some deposits, right? But that said, it is really important for everyone to do their own work, and the work is different, right? If you are a member of a dominant group, whether it's, if we talk about racial domination, dominant, but we all have, so I think it's important to say we all have multiple identities, right? Multiple identities. So I can identify as African American. Clearly that is a subordinate category in the U.S. I can identify as female, subordinate category. I can identify as heterosexual, dominant category. I can identify as Christian, dominant category. I can identify as able-bodied, dominant category, right? We all have places where we're dominant, and, if you wait long enough, I'm not yet ready to declare myself old, but when I'm old, that's a targeted category too, right? So even if you are dominant in all places except age, right? I mean, let's say you're a 21-year-old white man. You're dominant in every category, assuming you're heterosexual, assuming you grew up middle class, assuming you are able-bodied. But sooner or later, if you live long enough, you'll be old, and then you're targeted. So we all have these multiple identities, or maybe you develop a disability, We all have these multiple identities, but we tend to be most aware of the identities we have in our targeted area, right? And we tend to be oblivious to the privilege that comes in our dominant area. So I didn't think much about the fact that I walked up the steps as an able-bodied person. There was no ramp, right? It didn't need a ramp, wasn't looking for a ramp. But if I'd been in a wheelchair, I would have been very aware of the fact no ramp, right? So when you're in a targeted category, you notice the things about your environment that are negatively impacting you. But those who are dominant don't necessarily notice those things. And part of doing the work as a dominant person in whatever category is to start to understand your privilege and what that means and the ways in which your privilege disadvantages. You know, if racism or any ism is a system of advantage, that means there are some people who are being systematically advantaged by that ism and some people who are systematically disadvantaged by that ism. And if you don't understand that, if that seems like, what is she talking about? There's some work to be done, right? At the same time, there is value, of course, of bringing people together to do, because how can we understand our differences if we don't talk about them? You know, you can't do that in a vacuum. You do have to do that work together. But it is important to acknowledge that not everything has to be done together. Some parts have to be done separately. And the challenge, my experience in doing unlearning racism work, is that white participants often get quite anxious about the idea that they should sit alone with white people and talk about whiteness. There is a book. Let's acknowledge our author here. She gave me a copy of her book, which is in my purse, I'm sorry to say. I can't hold it up, called Witnessing Whiteness. Shelley Tolshuk is the author, and I don't know if there are copies of it here, but they're gone now. Good thing they're gone now. But you can get some more, Witnessing Whiteness. But here's the thing. The idea of, I remember in one of these opportunities, one of these workshops, doing like a weekend retreat. And it was a multiracial group, as you would expect. And then there was a moment when the groups were asked to separate for a period of time. You know, the white people were going to be together, the people of color were going to be together. Usually in those moments, the people of color are happy. It's a deposit. A deposit is coming, right? Are happy to have that opportunity to like not be asked about, you know, anything that's uncomfortable. I mean, to be able to just sort of support one another and bond. The white people tend to get together and look at each other like, why are we here? I'm not sure what we're supposed to do now. I mean, I'm not trying to be funny. This is what typically happens. And there's often a lot of discomfort. And this sense of what possible value could there be at an unlearning racism workshop for white people to sit together by themselves? Some people approach that experience with that question. And the answer is huge value, right? Huge value. And I remember being in a group once where this question was asked, and one of the white women in the group stood up and said, everything we need to know about racism is right here in this room. And it was a very profound statement, but indeed it was true, you know, that you don't necessarily have to always ask a person of color to become aware of that hidden wound that Wendell Berry talked about in his book. And I taught for many years. My book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race, is largely inspired by over 20 years of teaching a course on the psychology of racism. And in that class, which was always a multiracial class, I found that there were things that, as the white students in my class became more and more aware of the socialization, their racial socialization, like things they remember their parents saying, or instances, you know, that happened, like maybe there was a black caretaker, and the way in which that black caretaker was excluded from the family in certain ways. You know, remembering those things became painful, and they'd want to talk about them. But if you were a young African-American woman in the class whose mother was a caretaker, you don't necessarily need to hear about that. It's another injury to you, right? So she may have a need to tell, you don't have a need to hear. And so if she has a need to tell, let her tell it to some white people, you know, in a group where they're talking to each other. And if that black student has some feelings, maybe anger, resentment, that she needs to discharge, let her do that in the company of peers who understand where she's coming from without having to worry that she's going to offend somebody. I know we're out of time, but what's important, let me just end in this way. You cannot reconcile without having a commitment to continued relationship. Thank you very much.